Hello, and welcome to Creepycore and Folklore, the show about creatures, encounters, old tales, and myths. I'm your host, Iona Wayland, a dark fantasy author, mental health professional, and overall curious person. I want to join other spooky souls and hear about these unusual stories. All right, episode 1. This is very exciting. I was at a loss of, at first, what this first episode should be about. There's so many possibilities. I wrote down a bajillion ideas and different topics I want to cover. I'm thinking, like, do I go with cryptids for the first one? Do I talk about ghost stories? Do I talk about alien encounters? Like, what am I going to do for this? There's so many different options. Like, what legends, what myths come to mind? So, as many of you probably already know, I am a new mom. I have a newborn, and there's many sleepless nights, and that helped me kind of dig into things that were kind of freaking me out, like like different myths and different like woo-woo stuff that was kind of creepy. And I'm a scaredy cat. Like, even though I love this stuff, I am a scaredy cat. So what was really surprising to me was when I was holding my baby between, like feedings and stuff and kind of wandering around, is I did not have a horrifying reaction to a giant spider web that had formed right outside my back door. It's huge. And it was very it was a weird looking spider web. It was kind of like spindly. It kind of looked like it was a cobweb almost, but if it hadn't been there the day before, and it was absolutely humongous. So I was really intrigued by this because I was like, what a thin, thready, like spider web. And there was this gigantic spider sitting right in the middle of it very proudly. So I was like, well, this is clearly not a cobweb. But the reason I bring this up is because I am, I guess, technically, like a lot of people, afraid of spiders. I think that, arachnophobia is a very common thing. And I think it comes from like our ancestors knowing not to touch those 8-legged creatures so that we wouldn't get poisoned or something or hurt. So I was surprised. I've never killed spiders. Like, even when my body reacts to it, I get goosebumps and the hairs raise up on my arms and on the back of my neck. And I don't much care for them in my home, but I've never killed them. And it was weird that I was having, while holding my baby, which I've been extra protective of my child, but I kind of walked up to it and was really staring at it. Luckily, it was behind, my back door is a sliding glass door. So I was able to keep my distance from this gigantic spider. But I was really intrigued. The web looked weird. The spider herself is very large and smooth, and so then I went deep diving into what kind of spider is this. And so I figured out, after a lot of searching, because I'm really not up to date with the different kinds of arachnids out there, I found out that it is in fact a she, and she is a glorious furrow orb weaver spider. And I was really attached to her for a couple weeks. Every time I would feed my baby, every few hours, and just little disclosure, my baby was born a bit early, and so the care for her is a bit more intense and more frequent, and so she eats a lot, and she's growing great, and she's really healthy and fine, and I'm very thankful for that. But she does eat quite a bit, so very frequently am I up during the night, like how I am recording this right now is between feedings, up at night. But every time I would feed my baby, I would kind of stand and while she's drinking, I would watch the spider just kind of sit there and kind of catch her own food. And so I thought that was really neat. Like we were all kind of connected, but it was really fascinating watching her. And I was like, felt this really deep connection to her. I know it's so weird to say that. So I really loved this, and I still do. She's still there. I'm looking at her right now, actually. I felt really attached to this furrow orb weaver spider, and I named her Angelique. And I thought it just sounded like a really pretty name. But clearly I have, when I was writing show notes for this, when I was taking notes for different things for this episode, I realized that Angela is the name of my heroine in my debut novel, my debut dark fantasy novel. And in the outro, I have more information about that if that sounds interesting to you, if you're a reader out there. But I just think Angelique is such a beautiful spider. And I thought, well, I mean, since I spent all this time researching spiders, I might as well make, this an omen and make my first episode based off of this 8-legged friend of mine. So I decided to make this first episode about spiders in general, anytime that they showed up in myths, legends, folklore, things like that. And I was very, very surprised to know that spiders show up way more in way more myths and legends than I ever would have guessed. The first one that came to mind for me was actually Anansi, the Spider-Man. And I have a mixed background of Irish, Caribbean, Black, Indigenous South American, and Asian. And so it was neat because I'm kind of a mixture of a lot of different things. But I am a first generation Caribbean American, Afro-Latina, very proud of that. And I was really surprised that the spider mythology goes through my, different backgrounds of my own roots. But it also branches out into a bunch of other backgrounds as well. And so I was really surprised by that. But the one that came to mind for me first, like the one that I knew already off the top of my head, was Anansi the Spider-Man, because it's a Caribbean folktale. And then I did more research and I found out that it actually comes from West Africa, specifically Ghana. And all these different myths and legends that I'm going to go through, I will have more details in the show notes if you want to look at the same resources that I looked at, or if you're curious, if you want to deep dive into this whole spider thing, I am here for it. So I wanted to tell you a little bit of the different things that I looked up and found. So starting with Anansi. So Anansi was called like the Spider-Man, and he was actually from the West Africa, Ghana specifically. It's in Ghanaian oral mythology, and it's the Ashanti people's god. I, though, almost want to call this Anansi doesn't always seem godlike to me, just because there doesn't seem to be like a lot of rituals or prayers or temples designated to Anansi. So I don't know if he maybe because of his background that I'm about to get into, because he wasn't originally a god or something, maybe that's why he wasn't so high up, or maybe he's taken on more of a fable at this point. But I'm just gonna bump him up to god status for this, just for simplicity's sake. But he's definitely has the trickster hero. So this guy, I always envisioned him when I was told these stories, because it's an oral tradition to share the Anansi different fables and stories and things like that. I always imagined Anansi as a black man that could transform into a little spider. And apparently that is one of the ways that he's depicted, is a man who can change into a spider. But he also can be like a hybrid of the two. Like sometimes the way stories are told, he's the hybrid of the two. Sometimes he's always a spider, sometimes he's always a man, but he's just like a very cunning, very intelligent man. So I'm not sure where like the spider came in, other than, you know, it is a smaller creature that has to survive different things. So I think that's pretty cool that it kind of took on that physiology. And I also learned that Anansi comes from the Ashanti word for spider. But I was surprised when I looked up the different retellings of Anansi. Some of them really mirrored what I was told when I was a kid, because I originally heard it from my granddad, who he is straight from Jamaica. He was very proud. Unfortunately, he has passed, but he was a very proud Jamaican man. But like, because it's an oral tradition, kind of all the different retellings are valid, and they all kind of complement each other. Like they all come from a similar thread. So I'm going to tell you some of the stories that I heard. It's very brief, 2 short ones that kind of go together. I always heard, apparently these are 2 separate stories, but I always heard them together. So how the story goes is that Anansi was a man that could transform into a spider, and he got his name as the storyteller, the weaver of tales. And he was really into storytelling, and he was a very wise person, and he is known for his cunning and illusion. So he approached the god of the Ashanti people. More specifically, he approached the sky god of the Ashanti people. And the sky god had a collection of all of the stories of the world and all of the wisdom in the world. And Anansi, he wanted to be the sole owner of all of these stories, which I find very interesting, because stories then were primarily oral tradition. So it was neat that in this like fable or this mythology that they were thinking about stories as like a tangible thing that could be owned. So I thought that was cool, because that didn't really come until a bit later. But so he talks to the sky god and he says, I really want to be the sole owner of all the stories of all of the world. And the sky god was like, fine, I'll give it to you, but you have to prove yourself. And by proving yourself, like how I know you'll be able to handle this is if you are able to present to me each of the deadliest creatures, the scariest, toughest creatures. So the first one he wants is a snake, or a python specifically. The next one he wants is a tiger. The next one he wants is a fairy. And the next one he wants is a like jar of hornets. And so Anansi was like, okay, let me do that. He kind of like puffed up his chest and he was like, I'm going to get all of these. I'll be right back. I'm not scared. I'm not afeared of nothing, So he walked on down from the sky god, and he decided to, like, how is this guy or this little spider or this man, whatever form you want to imagine him as, how is he going to capture a python without getting harmed? So he brought his wife with him, and I like that she was like kind of like his wing woman. I like that she kind of like talked him up, hyped him up. So he kind of staged this argument with his wife where he's like, no, the python is much longer than that. And she kind of like loudly was like, well, I don't think the python is that long. And they were kind of arguing about it very loudly around where they knew the python lived. And the python kind of crept up and was like, what are you guys talking about? And he's like, my wife doesn't think you're very long. And he was like, I'm super long, I'm super humongous, and I'm very scary. And Anansi's like, I know that. And, you know, I think that you're longer than a palm tree. And he's like, I am longer than a palm tree. And his wife is like, I don't think so. I don't think you are. And so Anansi kind of was like, oh, listen, Python dude, help me prove my wife wrong, because I know I'm right. I know you're right. You're much tougher and you're much scarier than what she thinks. So let's prove her wrong. So he felled a palm tree and he said, all right, stretch along this palm tree and see how long you are. So he tried to stretch, but every time he stretched one way, the other end of him would curl up. So if he stretched his head out really far, his tail would curl up. If he stretched his tail out flat, then his head would start curling up. And he's like, oh man, I know I'm longer than this, but like I keep like kind of twirling around. And so Anansi was like, okay, you're fine. I will tie you to, what if I tie both ends of you to this palm tree? And he was like, okay, you go ahead and do that. That way we'll show her. So he tied the python to the palm tree, and the python's like, yeah, see, look how humongous I am. And Anansi's like, yep, and took him straight up to the sky god. So there was 1 down, 3 to go. So the next one he had to catch was the tiger, and he is such a small spider, or such a small man, however you want to visualize him. He's like, this tiger is like humongous. So he found a tiger sleeping, and while the tiger was sleeping, he decided to dig a hole, like a giant pit, and covered the pit with leaves. And by covering the pit with leaves, the tiger wouldn't know that he basically like dug a pit or a moat like around where he was sleeping. So when the tiger woke up, he fell deep into the hole and he was calling for help. And Anansi peered over the side and was like, oh, you're really stuck down there. And he's like, yes, can you help me, please? Please help me out of this pit. And Anansi was like, absolutely. So he kind of let down his thread, his sticky web thread. And the tiger was really grateful, and he started using it to climb up, but he would kind of get it wrapped around him and it would stick to him, and he'd need to be lowered more and more. So even though he was coming out of the pit, he was slowly getting raveled in this sticky web. And when he was finally cocooned in all of it, Anansi got him, when he was cocooned fully, he was at the top of the pit, and Anansi just kind of like took him up to the top to the sky god and was like, here you go, another 1 down. The fairy one, the next one that he had to try and trick, was very interesting to me. This one kind of, the more I researched, some people don't have like this particular creature, like the fairy creature, in mind at all. Like it kind of is either left out of the story, or the way Anansi captures this fairy is different. But the one I was particularly told was fairies are like believed to be like these demonic forces, and they're always trying to like trick people. They kind of have like sprite like energy, or almost like poltergeisty. That's just like the vibe I'm getting from how they were thought of. So Anansi got to finding this fairy. I don't know how he did it, but he did. And he kind of set up a dummy of some sort, like a wooden carving of a person. And I'm not really sure of the significance here when it comes to fairies being drawn to a person or wanting to talk to people. But somehow, and forgive me for not knowing the exact history of this, but somehow it like lured the fairy over. And because this dummy cutout person carving wasn't talking to her, she got angry, and Anansi knew she would smack him, like smack the dummy. And Anansi had already covered the dummy in sticky sap. So whenever she smacked him, her hand got stuck. And then when she tried to use her other hand to pull her hand off, her other hand got stuck. And then she tried to fly away and the sap got in her wings, and it was like a whole thing. So she got really stuck in this sap, and he was able to present her to the sky god. So the last one was the hornets, and this one is going to be like the most challenging in his mind, because it's not just one creature that he has to try and fool. So he ran up a tree where he found a hornet's nest, and he got his clay jar that he's supposed to collect them in, the clay pot, and the clay pot was full of water. So he spilled the water on him, like a little bit on himself first, and so he'd like look wet, and then he spilled the water on the hornet's nest, and all the hornets came out, and they were very angry, and they were about to sting him, and he was like, wait, I got rained on, there was this crazy storm, didn't you see it? And they're like, no, I didn't see it, nothing like a little bit of gaslighting just to trick some bees. So these hornets were like, oh my gosh, what are we gonna do? Like, our nest is wet, like I don't know what to do. And he's like, luckily I have just enough room in this clay jar, and if you go in there, that'll offer you more protection than your nest. And so they all went in there, he corked it, and he brought that up to the sky god. So he had won all the stories of all of the world fair and square, and he was gifted all the wisdom of the world. But he was like, I am the most wise person, and I don't want to share these stories with other people. I don't want to share the wisdom with other people. And this is where he kind of seems like otherworldly to me, because the way I was told this traditionally was that he was very like cunning and strong, but he didn't see himself as a human. Like, he didn't think that stories and that this level of wisdom was appropriate for humankind. So that's where he's kind of like this, well, we already know he's like a magical being, but this is where he's kind of like in a different realm, so to speak. So he was like, I'm going to hide it someplace where no human could ever find it. And his son overheard him. I know, like, we're just throwing in wives and sons here, where it's just like, where were these characters before? I don't know. But his son overheard him and was like, well, that's not really fair, and I want to know where these stories are. So he like totally did what I would have done as a kid and secretly followed his dad while his dad was out taking the he must really like clay jars, because he put all the stories of all of the world and all of the wisdom of all the world in this clay jar, but it was really heavy because it was filled with so much knowledge. And so he's trying to take this clay jar up a tree, but he's trying to push it up the tree. So this is where apparently these are two different stories. I think they go together, but that's just because I was told them together all the time. So Anansi had this giant clay jar of all the stories and all the wisdom, and he tried to push it up a tree really up high so that no human would try and climb and find it. But he kept falling down. Like, he kept trying to push it up, but it was too heavy and it slid down. And so his son got really frustrated with his dad, and finally he came out from hiding and was like, Dad, oh my gosh, why don't you just tie it to your body and like have it behind you instead of trying to push it up against gravity? And he was like, oh my gosh, you're right, I can't believe I didn't know this. And like, so he had this like aha moment, like this humble moment where he's like, here I am, I'm supposed to be the god now of wisdom and stories and information, and I couldn't even figure out how to hide this jar. So he got really angry and he smashed the jar on the ground, and when it shattered, all of the stories and wisdom escaped all across the lands. So that's how people have kind of like this collective inventiveness and silver tongue, so to speak, or like insightfulness to them and all this wisdom is because Anansi got angry and smashed it into little pieces, and all the information kind of flooded out. There are many different versions to these fables. There's pretty much like endless fables. I mean, there's so many ways you could tell that story, and different takes you can get from it, like different symbolisms or life paths to take from these lessons being told. So it was really usable in that way. And what I thought was interesting too is that I remember being, I want to say second or third grade, but I remember one of my teachers reading an Anansi story and being really excited about it, because I was like, wow, I didn't know other people knew about Anansi. And then I learned that these books were being more popularized, and I think Neil Gaiman even included Anansi in his American Gods book, but I'm not sure. I'll have to double check that. But there was like this more inclusive understanding of Anansi, and that's very odd because it started in West Africa. And I come to find out that it came to America, because that's where I'm from. I'm American. It came to America by way of slave trade, unfortunately. And so even though it started in West Africa, it came to the Caribbean because that's where a lot of slaves ended up. And it also came to America. And when, these people and my ancestors were stripped of their cultural background, it was really incredible because they were able to cling to these oral traditions and share them not just amongst themselves, but with other slaves that they were forced to be with. And Anansi became like a very celebrated character because he was able to survive off of his cunning. He was able to go up against these like really intense forces. I mean, the first person he took on was the sky god, for God's sake. So he was like a bit of their culture that was stolen from them. He was a survivor story, and he was just like a symbol of hope, in that if you're able to come up with a plan, like you can intellectually work your way through things. I think that's such a powerful message too. Like, here is this little spider, just but a spider, something that can be squished, but he worked out a way that he could get through that, and he could go up against these repressive forces. So I really like that Anansi was a symbol of hope and survival. Another very powerful storytelling device that spiders were used in are from the Navajo spider rock. So in this particular background, the Navajo tribe would tell stories, also oral stories, so this also has some differences to it, about Spider Rock. And how this goes is that there was a young girl who went to Spider Rock to try and see someone called the Spider Woman, and she could hear a tiny little voice calling from a crack in the earth. And so she kind of followed this voice and got closer, and she peered into the crack and kind of saw the Spider Woman, who was much smaller than she thought, living in this teeny little crevice where she had her own little room. And on the walls of her room, she had beautiful tapestries that she had woven herself with her silks. And the girl was like, wow, you have such a beautiful tapestries, like gorgeous, gorgeous tapestries. Please, can you teach me how you made them? Because I would love to hang these up in my room. And the Spider Woman was like, okay, I can teach you, but you have to promise to share what you learn with other women in your tribe and with other people, and share this skill. And I just think that's so beautiful because it's the exact opposite. Anansi is like, this is my information and I have the right not to share it. Whereas this Spider Woman was like, I want you to share this skill with other people. So this little girl learned about the loom, and the top of the loom is supposed to represent the sky, and the bottom part of the loom is supposed to represent the earth. And as you loom, you kind of combine the earth and sky together over and over again. And she also showed the girl how to make dyes out of the earth. So like different colors were representative of different things. And to just basically like channel the forces of nature through you into your loom and to create these different patterns and use these different kinds of colors to kind of weave all of the earth together and represent all of the earth and tell the story of the earth, which I think is just such gorgeous imagery. Like when I imagine the weaving and the intention behind weaving these different portions of the earth that we all share together. Something else that I wanted to bring up that was one of the rules was that this Spider Woman was like, make sure that you create an energy pathway and you create like a little portal within your work for you to have your energy escape from it. Because if you don't make this portal, all of your creative energy will be trapped within this tapestry and you won't be able to weave anymore. And the whole point of this is to share the story that the earth told you through your work and to share the skill with other people in your tribe. And so the girl learned how to do it and she taught other people how to do it, and they were able to make these beautiful tapestries that told stories about their backgrounds and the different ways the earth spoke to them. Another indigenous peoples that I wanted to include with the whole spider symbology, and there are many different tribes with many different stories, like all across the United States, South America, North America, everywhere there are tribal folks who have this symbology of the spider, but I wanted to specifically focus on the Hopi tribe in particular, just because the Hopi tribe and the Navajo tribe kind of coexist within the same areas of Arizona together. So I just was like, how am I going to narrow down to just a couple different stories? Because there were so many. But so the Hopi tribe I thought was really interesting. They also have a Spider Woman, and there's a Hopi legend. And so the Spider Woman was said to be the life creator. So there's a whole big long story as to where the Hopi people come from and their legends about how they came to be as a group of people, and it's very, very beautiful. But if I just hone in on the spider mythology specifically, there was this Spider Woman, and she's depicted as, well, it can change, her depiction can change, but she's more depicted as like a woman with like multiple limbs and is more spidery in that way. So this Spider Woman was made to create life. So she took a bit of the earth and mixed it with her saliva, and she created two people. And one was Okamhoya and the other was Halangahoya. Also, forgive me for not pronouncing these correctly. I may be pronouncing them wrong. Actually, it's pretty likely that I am. So if you want to read this, the whole story in its entirety, not just the spider part, and have the correct like spelling and pronunciation, then you can check out the book where this came from. Even though this is an oral history, it was written down by Oswald Whitebear and Naomi Fredericks, and they titled their book The Four Creations. So I'll make sure I put that in the show notes for anyone who's curious about this Hopi legend. But anyway, so Okamhoya was sent across the earth to solidify it. So they were in charge of solidifying the earth, making the actual places where people could habitate, while Halangahoya was sent to send sound and resonation of the earth. So the sound of creation and the vibrations of the overall creator of the world. And what I think is cool is they were told to travel the earth. And so one ended up at the North Pole and the other one ended up at the South Pole. So I thought that was really cool. So then she created flowers and plants and birds, animals, trees, and then finally humans, and how she created humans, which I think is very fascinating because this is shown very frequently in a lot of origin stories when it comes to religions, folktales, legends, things like that. But what she did was she took different types of clay, like all these different types of clay, yellow, black, white, and red earth is how it's described, and mixed it with her saliva, and she sang the song of creation. And when she sang this, she made all of the people in all of the world. And I just thought that was such a beautiful, beautiful story. And that is in particular, like, it goes on to talk about like the 4 different earths that were created for the people and which ones followed their creator's advice and which ones strayed from the path. And it's a very powerful story. It's very intense, very powerful, lots of symbology there. So it's a neat story to explore for sure, even though I only covered just a little bit of it. The last one that I'm going to cover is the Celtic goddess Arianrhod. I was able to look up how to pronounce this, Arianrhod. And just watch, I'm saying it like really over enunciated. It's probably Arianrhod. And I'm just like making every syllable count. But anyway, this is a Celtic Welsh goddess, and her name means silver wheel. And she is described as one of 5 goddesses from the Isle of Avalon. So this is sounding very like fantasy-esque, which makes sense because a lot of fantasy, for whatever reason, is kind of like mirroring European folklore. But anyway, so Arianrhod lived with her other like siblings, and I think she had more than just sisters, but I think she lived primarily with her sisters. That one was a little tougher for me. It was actually kind of difficult to find information on her with what I was doing. So if anyone else knows more about this or worships her in any way, I would love to know more about her. I would love to know more about anybody that I'm talking about, but she is definitely the one that I had a tougher time finding information about. But for her, there wasn't a particular like fable or legend or mythology behind her that I could find. I'm sure there's stuff out there. I more saw the symbology that she had. So she is seen as this like full moon goddess and the goddess of like the silver wheel. So the silver wheel can that she weaves. So she weaves the silver wheel that can kind of represent like the full moon, or the wheel can also represent a year that crosses over and repeats. It also can represent fertility. And I think fertility was included in here because thinking of like some bodies have the moon cycle within them, like menstruation. But there was also, it was related to fate, which I thought was really, really interesting, of seeing like the threads of fate. But she's often thought of as spinning and weaving the tapestry of birth and rebirth. So I thought that was really interesting too, because I didn't have the knowledge before I did some of this research that reincarnation was often a thought process or a belief system within Celtic pagan religions, which I had no idea that that was even a thing. It's also said that she has a castle specifically designated to her, the castle of Arianrhod. I'm just butchering this name. This is awful. But and this is in like designated in the constellation, specifically the Corona Borealis constellation. And it's said that when people go there, it's portals to other worlds. So if you go there after you pass away, then you pass through and you're able to be reborn. So I thought that was interesting. And I also think that it's, if I'm understanding this correctly, that if someone is able to find this spiraling staircase of a castle, because a lot of hers are shown as like woven spiral type symbology, then you're able to have the gift of a silver tongue or the gift of cunning, which I think is very interesting because that is very similar to Anansi that I talked about in the beginning. So there was a lot of different stories that I covered, and there are so many intersecting webs, I did that on purpose, of like symbology here. So there's like the weaving, the cunning, portals, wisdom, and just also make sure to check out the show notes if you're really curious about any of these and you want to look into them on your own. But there's just so much overlapping and symbolism that I found. And it's even more like there's even more than just the very few that I covered that I was able to find information on. Like there's beautiful symbolism of spiders in India, Italy, the Cherokee peoples, Greek folks, Jewish mythologies. Like it spans the entire world of these histories with spiders. And I only included a couple here. But I thought it was really interesting that none of them that I have found talked about the spider being like bad or evil. Like the worst, and worst is in quotation marks here, the quote worst unquote of it was like not even bad. It was like, oh, this person is, this god or goddess is able to like trick someone, or they were able to use their cunning to survive something or get to a certain goal. But it wasn't told in a way that was like malicious. It was all very like survival focused and future thinking and like recognizing patterns and weaving yourself into your creativity. Like it's a lot of a really beautiful like storytelling creation type stuff. So let me know if you'd like to hear some of those other tales that I was able to find. It's just truly incredible how beloved the spider is and celebrated to this day, even in neo-paganism, magic, and, you know, also from me. I'm going to celebrate the spider as well as a tired mom who sees Angelique every night as a good omen while I'm feeding my baby. But now I'm going to head to bed, and hopefully my baby sleeps for a little bit longer than she has been sleeping. And I'm going to turn on the light outside for Angelique to catch more bugs. And I hope everyone has a wonderful time and they were able to get some kind of neat information about the oh so feared spider that maybe can be a symbol of hope for everybody. Thanks to all you spooky souls out there for listening to Creepycore and Folklore. Follow on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok if you're looking for more uncanny content. If you have your own tales to tell, you can email creepycoreandfolklore@gmail.com. If you liked this, please leave a review wherever you get your podcasts, or tell a friend who might enjoy these stories to spread the word. If you're interested in dark fantasy, check out my Hollowverse series. Ashes is available now in paperback and ebook on Amazon and audiobook on Audible, and the sequel is underway. I'm Iona Wayland, and I'll see you next time.